When an 8-year-old boy showed up at the clinic with severe burns, he begged the nurse not to tell his dad. But when the father finally rushed in, Clara was stunned. He was an active-duty Navy SEAL, yet his knuckles were shattered, his face was bruised, and he looked completely broken. Clara was ready to report him to Child Protective Services for neglect until she discovered the devastating truth. The SEAL wasn't abandoning his son. He was secretly fighting in brutal, underground matches every single night to pay off his dead wife's medical debt. And now, the state was coming to take his boy away, unless Clara broke every rule she knew to save them. The fluorescent lights of the outpatient pediatric clinic hummed a low, steady note. It was 9:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. Clara Vance was charting her last patient of the night when the automatic doors slid open. An older woman, looking flustered in a bathrobe and winter coat, hurried toward the triage desk. Trailing just behind her was an 8-year-old boy. He wasn't crying. In fact, his face was unnervingly blank, but his right arm was cradled tightly against his chest, wrapped in a kitchen towel that was already soaking through with clear fluid. "I'm his neighbor," the woman explained breathlessly. "I heard a crash next door. His father isn't home, and I didn't know what else to do." Clara stood up immediately. Her professional demeanor kicked in, calm and anchoring. "You did the right thing." She stepped around the counter and knelt to the boy's eye level. "Hi there, I'm Clara. What's your name?" "Leo," the boy said. His voice was remarkably steady, though a fine tremor shook his small shoulders. "Well, Leo, let's take a look at that arm." Clara led him to exam room 3. When she gently peeled back the towel, she didn't flinch, though her stomach tightened. It was a severe second-degree burn, blistering across the back of his hand and creeping up his forearm. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't a splash from hot tap water. This was a grease burn. "That looks like it hurts," Clara said softly, moving to the sink to prep a saline flush. "Can you tell me how it happened?" Leo looked down at his sneakers. "I was just playing by the stove. It was an accident." It was a lie. Clara had worked in the burn unit for 5 years before moving to outpatient care. She knew the difference between a child knocking over a pan and a child trying to pull a heavy hot skillet off a burner that was too high for them to safely reach. "Leo," Clara said, keeping her voice light, "it's okay to tell me the truth. Where is your dad tonight?" The boy's posture instantly went rigid. He looked up, and the sheer panic in his eyes belonged on the face of an adult. "Please," Leo whispered, his voice cracking for the first time. "Please don't tell my dad. He works too hard. He's always tired. If he knows I messed up, he's going to be so mad at himself. You can't tell him." Before Clara could process the strange phrasing, times "he's going to be mad at himself" times heavy footsteps echoed down the clinic hallway. The door to the exam room swung open. The man filling the doorway was tall, broad-shouldered, and completely out of breath. He wore a faded canvas jacket. But what caught Clara's attention was his face. It was the face of a man running on absolute zero. Dark, bruised shadows hung under his eyes. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked near his ear. "Leo," the man breathed, stepping into the room. Clara stood, instinctively placing herself slightly between the man and the boy. "Are you the father?" "Elias Thorne," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He didn't look at Clara. His eyes were locked on his son's bandaged arm. He looked terrified. Then, Elias reached up to drag a hand through his short, military-cut hair. When he did, Clara saw his hand. His knuckles were split, purple, and heavily bruised. They were the hands of a man who had just been in a brutal, bare-knuckle fight. Clara's medical instincts sharpened into something entirely different. A battered father. An 8-year-old cooking alone at night. A boy terrified of adding to his father's burden. Something in the Thorne household was deeply, dangerously wrong. Elias stepped forward, his bruised hands hovering over Leo but not quite touching the fresh bandages, as if he was afraid his rough hands would somehow cause more pain. "I'm sorry, buddy," Elias whispered. The gravel in his voice cracked, betraying the exhaustion beneath his stoic expression. "It's okay, Dad, I'm fine," Leo said quickly, sitting up straighter on the exam table. "It doesn't even hurt. You don't have to worry." Clara disposed of the medical waste and turned to face Elias. She kept her tone professionally neutral, though her gaze dropped pointedly to his split knuckles. "Mr. Thorne, can you tell me where you were this evening?" Elias shifted his weight, pulling his hands into the pockets of his faded jacket. "I had to work. A late shift. I thought he was asleep." Clara crossed her arms. Leo told me he was playing by the stove, but this is a severe grease burn. And the neighbor who brought him in handed our triage nurse a pair of adult-sized oven mitts covered in cooking oil. Your son wasn't playing, Mr. Thorne. He was trying to cook dinner. Elias flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a sudden tightening of the jaw. But Clara caught it. He looked down at Leo, a flash of pure agony crossing his face before the military-grade mask slammed back into place. He knows he's not supposed to use the stove, Elias said, his voice flat. It was the tone of a man used to giving orders, but it sounded hollow in the small clinic room. He's 8 years old, Clara replied, her voice firm but quiet, mindful of the boy watching them. He shouldn't have to know how. Mr. Thorne, as a medical professional, I am a mandatory reporter. If I suspect a child is being neglected left alone at night, in a dangerous environment, I am required by hospital protocol and state law to file a report with Child Protective Services. Elias's head snapped up. The exhaustion in his eyes was instantly replaced by a sharp, territorial panic. You don't need to do that. He is well taken care of. It was a one-time mistake. It won't happen again. Please, Miss Clara, Leo chimed in, sliding off the exam table. He stepped in front of his father, acting as a tiny, desperate shield. Don't call anyone. Dad is the best. He just has to work a lot because we have rules now. I broke the rule about the stove. It's my fault. Clara looked between the hypervigilant father and the fiercely protective son. She had seen neglect in this clinic. She had seen abuse. This didn't look like either. This looked like a man drowning, trying to hold his child above water, while the child tried to paddle for both of them. I am going to document this as an accidental thermal injury for tonight, Clara said slowly, watching Elias's tense shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. But he needs his dressings changed in 3 days. By me. Here in this clinic. Elias nodded once, a crisp affirmative. We'll be here. He helped Leo with his coat, wincing slightly as he moved his own shoulders. As they walked out of the clinic, Clara watched them go. She noted the slight limp in Elias's step and the way Leo held onto his father's belt loop. She wasn't going to call CPS tonight, but as she looked at the oil-stained oven mitts left on the counter, Clara decided she also wasn't going to let this go. By Friday evening, the waiting room at the outpatient clinic was completely empty. Clara stood at the nurse's station, her eyes fixed on the digital clock on the wall. It was 6:30 p.m. Elias Thorne had promised to bring Leo in for his dressing change at 3 o'clock. They were 3.5 hours late. Clara pulled up the Thorne file on her monitor. She stared at the address listed on the digital intake form. Going to a patient's home off-duty was a massive breach of protocol. It was the kind of boundary crossing that hospital administrators fired people for. But Clara couldn't stop thinking about the boy's panicked eyes, or the dark purple bruises across his father's knuckles. Burns were highly susceptible to infection, especially grease burns left in the care of an overwhelmed parent. She grabbed her coat and a small canvas medical bag from her locker, clocked out, and walked to her car. The address belonged to a modest, single-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The lawn was neatly mowed, but the house itself looked desolate. The front windows were completely dark, save for a single dim yellow light spilling from the kitchen. Clara stepped onto the porch and knocked firmly. A minute passed. Then, the sound of a deadbolt clicking. The door opened a few inches, held fast by a security chain. Leo's face appeared in the gap. "Nurse Clara?" he asked, his voice a mixture of surprise and nervous apprehension. "Hi, Leo," she said, keeping her voice soft. "You missed your appointment today. I wanted to make sure your arm was okay. Can I come in?" Leo hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before unhooking the chain. As Clara stepped inside, the first thing that hit her was the cold echo of her own footsteps. She stopped in the entryway, her breath catching slightly. The living room was completely bare. There was no couch, no television, no rugs, no pictures on the walls. The only items in the room were a single metal folding chair and a sleeping bag neatly rolled in the corner. This wasn't just a struggling family. They had sold everything they owned. She turned her attention back to Leo. He was standing in the kitchen, holding a frozen tray of macaroni and cheese. On his uninjured left hand, he wore one of the oversized oven mitts from the other night. The bandage on his right arm was fraying at the edges, gray with dirt and clearly untouched since Clara had applied it. "Leo, where's your dad?" Clara asked, setting her medical bag on the empty kitchen counter. Leo looked down at his sneakers. "He had to go back to work. He said he'd be back before I woke up." He promised. He went to work tonight? Clara asked, her brow furrowing. Leo, what kind of work does your dad do? The boy shifted uncomfortably, peeling the plastic film off his dinner with his good hand. I don't know exactly, but he has to do the night shifts to keep the house. He says it's just until we catch up. Clara didn't press him further. She took the frozen meal from his hands, put it in the microwave, and opened her medical bag. Sit down, buddy. Let's get that old bandage off. She was just finishing taping the fresh, clean gauze to his forearm when the heavy sound of a diesel engine rumbled down the quiet street. A truck door slammed. Heavy, uneven footsteps approached the front porch. The front door handle turned. The front door swung open, hitting the wall with a dull thud. Elias Thorne stepped into the entryway, and the air in the house seemed to instantly freeze. If he had looked bad at the clinic 3 days ago, tonight he looked like a man who had barely survived a war zone. His canvas jacket was torn at the shoulder. He favored his left leg heavily, dragging his weight. A fresh, dark bruise bloomed along his jawline, and his lip was split, a thin line of dried blood trailing down his chin. He stopped dead when he saw Clara standing in his kitchen. The exhaustion vanished from his eyes, replaced immediately by the sharp, lethal focus of a combat veteran assessing a threat. His shoulders squared. What are you doing in my house? The words were low, carrying a dangerous territorial edge. Clara didn't step back. She closed her medical bag with a calm, deliberate zip. You missed your appointment, Mr. Thorne, 3.5 hours ago. Your son's bandage was filthy, and the wound edge was starting to look red. I came to do my job. Elias looked from Clara to Leo. He saw the fresh white gauze on his son's arm. The anger in his eyes wavered, fracturing into something that looked terribly close to shame. Who let you in? Elias demanded, though the bite was gone from his voice. I did, Dad, Leo said quickly, stepping forward. She just wanted to help, and you said you'd be home by 3. I didn't know what to do. I told you not to open the door for anyone. Elias ran a bruised hand over his face. I got held up. It took longer than I thought. You don't need to be here, Miss Vance. We're fine. You are clearly not fine, Clara countered, her professional mask slipping enough to show genuine alarm. You look like you were thrown out of a moving vehicle, and you left an 8-year-old home alone. I do what I have to do, Elias snapped, his voice booming in the empty house. The shout drained the last reserve of adrenaline, keeping him upright. As soon as the words left his mouth, Elias's knees buckled. He didn't fall completely, catching himself against the doorframe. But his chest heaved as he fought for air, his eyes squeezed shut, his head hanging in sheer defeat. The formidable, intimidating SEAL captain vanished, leaving only a broken, exhausted father desperately trying to stay on his feet. Clara moved toward him instinctively, her hands reaching out, but Leo was faster. The 8-year-old didn't scream. He didn't cry. He moved with a practiced, heartbreaking efficiency. Leo rushed to the refrigerator, opened the freezer door, and pulled out a plastic bag of ice. He wrapped it in a dish towel, walked over to his father, and pressed it against Elias's ribs. Sit down, Dad, Leo said, his high voice steady. I'll get your water. Clara stood frozen. She watched a child carefully guide his battered father to the only piece of furniture in the room, the metal folding chair. Elias sank into it, pulling his son into his side, burying his face in Leo's small shoulder for a single, unguarded second. Clara stepped back to give them space, turning her gaze toward the kitchen counter. Next to the microwave, shoved under a cheap plastic napkin holder, was a thick stack of mail. The envelopes were all identical. They were printed with aggressive red lettering across the front. Urgent. Final notice. Medical collections. Clara looked at the bruised man, the empty house, and the red ink. Suddenly, the impossible puzzle of Elias Thorne clicked into place. Clara's hand hovered over the stack of mail. The aggressive red lettering blurred together. Final notice. Leon warning. Immediate action. Required. Don't, Elias said. His voice was raw, stripped of its earlier hostility. Clara turned. Elias was still sitting on the metal chair, the ice pack held against his ribs. Beside him, the adrenaline had finally drained from Leo. The 8-year-old was leaning against his father's good arm, his eyes heavy, fighting a losing battle against sleep. Let's get him to bed, Clara said softly. Elias nodded. With a grimace that he tried to hide, he stood up and scooped the boy into his arms. He carried Leo to the corner of the living room, laying him down gently on the sleeping bag and tucking a thin blanket around his shoulders. He waited until the boy's breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep before walking back into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, refusing to look at Clara. $200,000? He said quietly. Clara froze. What? 200,000? Out of pocket. Elias stared at the cheap linoleum floor. My wife. She had an aggressive form of leukemia. TRICARE covered the standard treatments. But when those stopped working, we went off script. Experimental trials. Private specialists. Anything to buy her another month, another week with Leo. He rubbed his bruised jaw. It didn't work. She passed away 14 months ago, and the collection agencies bought the debt. They're threatening to put a lien on this house. It's the only home Leo has ever known. Clara looked around the empty room. That's why you sold everything. It barely made a dent, Elias muttered. My seal pay covers the mortgage and the groceries. That's it. So I took a second job. Working nights? Clara looked at his split lip and his battered knuckles. Her medical background connected the dots with chilling clarity. Elias, are you fighting? He finally looked at her, his eyes dark and hollow. Unregulated private security. Underground rings down at the shipyards. It's brutal and it's illegal, but they pay in cash at the end of every shift. Every dollar goes straight to the agency. You could declare bankruptcy, Clara pleaded, her heart breaking at the sheer weight this man was carrying. You don't have to literally bleed for this. If I declare bankruptcy, they liquidate assets. I promised my wife I wouldn't touch Leo's college fund. I promised her he would have a normal life. Elias's voice cracked. I am trying to keep that promise. I just need a few more months to clear the worst of it. I thought I could handle the sleep deprivation. I thought I was keeping him safe. He looked toward the living room, watching his son sleep on the floor. Then he burned his arm because I wasn't here to make him dinner. I'm a combat operator, Miss Vance. I've kept entire platoons alive. But I am failing my own son. The midpoint of the puzzle locked into place. Clara had walked into this house, ready to condemn a negligent father. Instead, she found a man destroying himself piece by piece to protect his child's future. He wasn't a monster, he was a martyr. You're not failing him, Clara said, stepping closer, her voice thick with emotion. But you can't survive this alone. Elias looked away, pride fighting with exhaustion. Before he could answer, Clara's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a calendar reminder for the next morning. A reminder that her hospital's administration system automatically flagged missed appointments for severe pediatric injuries. Elias wasn't just fighting the collection agencies anymore. By tomorrow morning, the hospital's automated system was going to alert Child Protective Services. Clara didn't tell Elias about the automated hospital system that night. She knew a man standing on the edge of a cliff didn't need to be pushed over it while he was bleeding. Instead, she packed up her medical bag, looked him directly in the eye, and told him she would be back the next evening. He tried to refuse. She ignored him. For the next 3 days, Clara Vance became the quiet anchor the Thorne household desperately needed. She arrived at 5:30 p.m. every evening, right after her shift ended, carrying a bag of groceries and her medical kit. The first night, she cooked a simple chicken stew. Because there was no dining table, they sat in a circle on the floor of the empty living room, eating out of bowls. For the first time since Clara had met him, Leo didn't act like a hypervigilant adult. He chattered about a school science project, his defensive walls completely down. Elias sat quietly, his bowl resting on his knees, watching his son with an expression of profound, quiet gratitude. After dinner, it was triage time. Clara always started with Leo. The grease burn was healing beautifully, the edges pink and clean, free of infection. Once Leo was settled with a library book on his sleeping bag, Clara turned her attention to Elias. I don't need a nurse, he muttered on the second night, sitting stiffly on the metal folding chair as she approached him with an ice pack and fresh athletic tape. Good, Clara said smoothly, pulling up a small wooden stool she had brought from her own apartment. Because right now, I'm just a guest who happens to know how to properly wrap a sprained wrist. Give me your hand. He hesitated, his pride warring with his physical pain. Slowly, he extended his bruised, battered hand. Clara worked in comfortable silence. Her touch was professional, but incredibly gentle. She didn't ask about the underground fights he had gone to the night before. She didn't judge the fresh, angry scrape along his collarbone. She simply cleaned the split knuckles and stabilized his joints. Elias watched her hands. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly, the gravel in his voice softer than it had ever been. "You don't owe us anything." "Sometimes people just need a minute to breathe, Elias," she replied, not looking up as she secured the white tape. "You've been holding your breath for 14 months. Let me carry the weight for an hour." Elias closed his eyes, his rigid shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. It was a microscopic surrender, the first time he had allowed anyone to step inside his perimeter since his wife passed. In the quiet of the empty house, the space between them felt unexpectedly safe. But safety is often an illusion. On Thursday morning, Clara was at her desk at the clinic, updating patient charts, when her office phone rang. It was the hospital's administrative director of pediatric welfare. "Miss Vance," the director's voice was crisp and strictly protocol. "I'm looking at the digital file for Leo Thorne. Severe grease burn, missed follow-up appointment, flagged for an unreachable parent. The automated system forwarded the file to Child Protective Services early this morning. A caseworker is on their way to the residence for an unannounced inspection right now." Clara's blood ran cold. The house was entirely empty, and Elias was fast asleep. Clara dropped the phone on her desk. She didn't bother clocking out or explaining to the charge nurse where she was going. She grabbed her keys and sprinted for the parking garage. The drive to the Thorne residence took 20 minutes. It felt like 2 hours. When Clara pulled onto the quiet suburban street, her worst fear was already parked in the driveway. A plain white sedan with municipal plates. Clara scrambled out of her car and ran to the front porch. The door was wide open. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. A woman in a sharp gray suit, the CPS caseworker, was standing in the center of the completely empty living room, writing furiously on a clipboard. Leo was sitting on his rolled-up sleeping bag, his knees pulled to his chest, looking terrified. And Elias was pacing like a caged animal. He was wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, clearly having been woken up from a dead sleep. The dark bruises on his face and knuckles were impossible to hide in the harsh daylight. His military discipline was fighting a losing battle against the sheer panic of a father watching a government official assess his fitness to keep his child. "I told you," Elias was saying, his voice tight, vibrating with suppressed anger. "We are in transition. The house is empty because we are redecorating. My son is perfectly safe." The caseworker looked up, her expression skeptical and completely unimpressed. "Mr. Thorne, there is no furniture. There is no food in the refrigerator. You appear to have been recently engaged in a violent physical altercation. And your 8-year-old son sustained a severe grease burn because he was left unattended at night to operate a stove." "He made a mistake," Elias barked, stepping forward, his protective instinct flaring. The caseworker took a step back, her pen pausing. "Mr. Thorne, please lower your voice, or I will request police assistance for this assessment." "Elias, stop." Clara stepped into the doorway, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Elias whipped his head around. When he saw her, the look of betrayal in his eyes was absolute. "You," he breathed, the word heavy with devastation. "You called them." "I didn't," Clara said firmly, walking straight into the room and placing herself between Elias and the caseworker. She turned her attention to the official. "I am Clara Vance, RN. I am the outpatient wound care specialist treating Leo Thorne." The caseworker frowned. "Miss Vance, this case was flagged by your hospital's automated system for suspected neglect, and the system lacks clinical context," Clara fired back, her professional authority fully engaged. "I have been monitoring Leo's burn daily. It is clean, healing optimally, and shows absolutely no signs of neglect. Mr. Thorne is an active-duty Navy SEAL. His current living situation is austere due to a recent financial restructuring following the medical death of his wife. He is not abusive. He is grieving, and he is trying to protect his son." The caseworker looked at Clara, then down at her clipboard. "Be that as it may, Miss Vance, I cannot ignore the lack of basic amenities or the father's physical condition. If I return in 48 hours and the financial and living situation has not demonstrably stabilized, I will have no choice but to file for an emergency temporary placement for the boy." She handed Elias a business card, turned, and walked out of the house. The silence she left behind was deafening. Elias stared at the card in his hand, his knuckles white. The military operator in him had run out of tactical options. The government was going to take his son. "I'll fix it," Elias whispered to the empty room. His eyes were completely hollow. "I'll get the money tonight." Panic in a trained military operator doesn't look like panic in a civilian. It looks like cold, terrifying efficiency. As soon as the CPS caseworker's car disappeared around the corner, Elias had shifted into a completely different gear. He didn't yell, he didn't pace. He picked up his phone and made a single, brief call. "Put me on the main card tonight." The shipyard warehouse. "I need the winner-takes-all purse." Clara had tried to reason with him, to tell him they could find a legal way to restructure the debt or appeal the caseworker's timeline, but Elias had simply shut her out. His perimeter had locked down. He had an objective 48 hours to prove financial stability, and he was going to secure it the only way he knew how, by putting his body on the line. At 10:30 p.m., Clara sat in her apartment, staring at the wall. The administrative threat hung over the Thorne family like a guillotine. She knew Elias was already injured. She knew the kind of underground, unregulated fights that happened at the industrial shipyards. Men didn't just walk away from the main card with $30,000 in cash, they bled for it. Sometimes, they didn't walk away at all. Unable to shake the dread settling in her chest, Clara grabbed her coat and drove back to the quiet suburban street. The Thorne house was cloaked in heavy, suffocating darkness. Only the dim yellow bulb above the porch illuminated the property. Clara knocked on the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The deadbolt clicked. The door opened to reveal Leo. This time, the 8-year-old wasn't putting on a brave face. The facade of the hyper-responsible man of the house had entirely shattered. Leo's face was streaked with tears, his small shoulders shaking as he stood in the freezing, empty entryway. "Leo," Clara breathed, dropping to her knees to meet his eyes. "Where is he?" "He left," Leo sobbed, the sound small and utterly broken. "He put me in bed and locked the doors, but I heard him on the phone earlier. He told the man he'd fight the big one tonight. To get the money for the government lady." Leo threw his uninjured arm around Clara's neck, burying his wet face in her shoulder. "He's already hurt," nursed Clara. "He was limping this morning. If he fights the big guys, they're going to hurt him really bad. What if he doesn't come back?" Clara held the trembling boy, her medical mind calculating the catastrophic risk. Elias was operating on sheer, panicked adrenaline. He wasn't thinking clearly. If he stepped into a shipyard ring with cracked ribs and bruised knuckles, he wouldn't survive 3 rounds. Worse, if the police raided the illegal venue, Elias would be arrested. A criminal charge for illegal fighting would guarantee CPS would take Leo away permanently. Elias's desperate attempt to save his family was about to destroy it. "He's going to come back," Clara said, her voice steady and absolute as she pulled back to look Leo in the eye. "I promise you. But you cannot stay here alone tonight." Clara stood up, taking Leo's good hand. She walked him directly next door, pounding on the neighbor's door until the older woman from the clinic answered. Clara quickly explained it was a family emergency and left Leo in her safe care. Then, Clara got back into her car and turned the ignition. She didn't know exactly where the shipyard warehouse was, but she knew how to find out. She was going to pull Elias Thorne out of the ring before he killed himself. The South Shipyard was a maze of rusted shipping containers, chain-link fences, and dimly lit industrial warehouses. Clara drove her sedan slowly through the gravel lot, looking for a concentration of vehicles. She found it behind an abandoned canning facility, dozens of pickup trucks and unmarked cars parked haphazardly under flickering halogen security lights. Clara parked out of sight, zipped her coat up to her chin, and walked toward the heavy steel side door where 2 massive men stood smoking. She didn't try to sneak past them. She walked straight up, her RN badge still clipped to her lapel, projecting absolute clinical authority. "I am looking for Elias Thorne," Clara said, her voice carrying the flat, unyielding tone she used when ordering surgical interns out of a trauma bay. "It is a medical emergency. If you don't go get him right now, I am calling an ambulance to this exact address." The threat of flashing lights at an illegal betting ring worked. The men exchanged a dark look, and one of them disappeared inside. 3 minutes later, Elias burst through the steel doors. He had his hands wrapped in cheap athletic tape. He wasn't wearing his jacket, just a fitted black t-shirt that showed the heavy taping Clara had applied to his ribs 3 days ago. The cold night air hit the sweat already beading on his forehead. "Leo!" Elias demanded, grabbing Clara by the shoulders, his eyes wild with terror. "Is it Leo? Is he hurt?" "He's physically fine," Clara said, her voice steady, refusing to back down from his intensity. "He's next door with the neighbor. But he is terrified. He thinks you're going to die tonight. Elias dropped his hands. A flash of relief followed instantly by a wall of defensive anger. What the hell are you doing here, Clara? You can't be here. You need to go home. I am not leaving, she fired back, stepping into his space. You are limping. You have cracked ribs. If you go into that ring tonight against someone who knows what they're doing, they are going to break you. And if they break you, or if this place gets raided, the state takes your son permanently. I don't have a choice, Elias roared, the sound echoing off the corrugated steel of the warehouse. He pointed a taped, bruised hand toward the building. The purse tonight is enough to get the collection agency off the house and prove to CPS I can provide. If I don't walk in there, I lose him anyway. He doesn't want the house, Elias, Clara shouted back, her voice cracking with the sheer force of her desperation. He wants his father. He doesn't care if you have furniture. He doesn't care if you live in a tiny apartment. He needs you alive, and he needs you awake. Elias stopped. The words hit him harder than any physical blow ever could. You are trying to save the life you had with your wife, Clara said softly, the anger draining from her, leaving only a heartbreaking truth. But she's gone, and trying to carry that ghost on your back is crushing the son you have right here. Let the house go, Elias. Stop bleeding for a building. Save your son. For a long, agonizing moment, the SEAL captain stood perfectly still in the freezing gravel lot. Then, the invisible perimeter he had held for 14 months finally shattered. Elias Thorne's knees gave out. He dropped to the gravel, burying his face in his taped hands. A rough, devastating sob tore from his chest, the sound of a man who had fought a war on two fronts and finally realized he couldn't win this one alone. Clara didn't hesitate. She knelt in the dirt beside him and wrapped her arms tightly around his shaking shoulders, pulling him against her. For the first time since his wife died, Elias let someone else hold the line. The fluorescent lights of the County Child Protective Services office were blindingly bright the next morning. Elias sat in a stiff plastic chair across from the caseworker's desk. He wore his dress uniform, a desperate, calculated attempt to project stability, but the crisp fabric couldn't hide the dark bruising along his jawline or the exhaustion etched deeply into his face. He wasn't alone. Clara sat directly to his right, wearing her RN badge, radiating calm authority. Nestled between them was Leo. The 8-year-old's uninjured left hand gripped his father's uniform trousers, while his right arm, freshly bandaged by Clara that morning, rested safely on his lap. The caseworker folded her hands over a manila folder. Mr. Thorne, I will be frank. The state does not look kindly on minors being left alone at night, nor on parents engaged in violent, unregulated activities. I am prepared to request an emergency placement. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't get defensive. The man who had been frantically trying to outrun his reality for 14 months had finally stopped running. I failed my son, Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it held the steady, undeniable weight of total honesty. My wife passed away a little over a year ago. She left behind $200,000 in medical debt. I was trying to pay it off without touching Leo's college fund and without selling the house she loved. I took night jobs, dangerous ones. I thought I was protecting him. Instead, I left him alone, and he got hurt. He looked down at Leo, his expression softening into absolute devotion. I will sell the house today. I will file for bankruptcy tomorrow. I will do whatever the state requires me to do. But do not take my son. He is all I have left. The caseworker's stern expression faltered. She looked at Clara. I am here as a mandatory reporter and a pediatric medical professional, Clara stated, her tone uncompromising. I have evaluated Leo's physical and emotional well-being over the past week. Yes, a mistake was made. But Leo is deeply bonded to his father. He is not a victim of abuse. He is a child of a grieving family that desperately needs systemic support, not separation. Removing him from the only secure anchor he has would cause catastrophic psychological trauma. As Clara spoke, Leo reached out. His small hand found Clara's fingers and held on tight. He didn't let go of his father's leg. He formed a bridge between them, sitting quietly in the center of the storm. The caseworker watched the three of them. She saw the battered, honest father. She saw the fiercely protective nurse. She saw a child who clearly felt entirely safe between them. She closed the manila folder. I am suspending the emergency removal, the caseworker said with a heavy exhale. Pending a strict 60-day probationary period. You must provide proof of legal financial restructuring, Mr. Thorne. And I want weekly check-ins from Miss Vance regarding the boys' welfare. You'll have them, Clara promised. They walked out of the government building together, stepping into the crisp morning air. Elias let out a breath he looked like he had been holding for a year. He turned to Clara, the rigid posture of the SEAL captain entirely gone. What now? He asked. Clara looked at him, her eyes steady. Now, we make the phone call you should have made 14 months ago. The naval base in Coronado was a place Elias Thorne had always associated with strength, competence, and unyielding self-reliance. Walking into the commanding officer's office to admit defeat felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. But Clara was waiting in the car with Leo. She had told him just before he walked through the gates. Asking for backup isn't surrendering, Elias. It's tactics. You're outnumbered. Call in the cavalry. Commander Hayes, a man who had served alongside Elias in 2 combat theaters, sat behind a heavy oak desk. He took one look at Elias's bruised jaw and the exhausted slump of his shoulders, and he immediately ordered his adjutant to close the door. Talk to me, Thorne, Hayes commanded quietly. Elias stood at parade rest, staring straight ahead. And for the first time in his military career, he laid all his vulnerabilities on the table. He explained the medical debt, the underground fights, the CPS investigation. He exposed the ruin of his personal life without excuses or justification. When he finished, the silence in the office was thick. Elias braced himself for the reprimand. He expected a lecture on conduct unbecoming an officer, a suspension of his security clearance, or a forced administrative leave. Instead, Commander Hayes picked up his desk phone. Get me the base JAG officer and the director of the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, Hayes ordered into the receiver. Priority 1. Tell them I have a Tier 1 operator whose family needs immediate logistical and financial restructuring. Hayes hung up and looked at Elias. The older officer's expression wasn't angry. It was profoundly disappointed. But not for the reason Elias thought. $200,000, Elias? Hayes said, shaking his head. 14 months? You took on the underground shipyard circuit when you had an entire community of brothers sitting right here waiting to help you? Sir, it was my responsibility, Elias started, his voice tight. My wife's debt. My son. I didn't want charity. It's not charity, it's extraction, Hayes countered sharply. You were taking heavy fire and you went radio silent. Don't ever do that again. We are going to put the Navy lawyers on those collection agencies. We'll restructure the debt, file the bankruptcy protection if we have to, and get the aggressive liens dropped. We protect our own, Captain Thorne. An hour later, Elias walked out of the base headquarters. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for over a year felt impossibly lighter. He held a folder filled with legal protections and a scheduled appointment with a military financial counselor. He walked back to the visitor parking lot. Clara's sedan was idling under a palm tree. When Elias opened the passenger door, Leo looked up from the back seat, his eyes wide and questioning. Clara sat in the driver's seat, her hands resting quietly on the steering wheel, waiting. They're taking the case, Elias said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide anymore. The Navy lawyers are handling the collection agencies. The house might have to go eventually, but they're going to make sure the debt is managed legally. No more night shifts. Leo let out a massive breath, slumping back against the seat, finally just an 8-year-old boy again. Elias looked at Clara. He reached across the center console, and his battered hand gently covered hers. Let's go home. 2 weeks later, the suburban house on the quiet street still didn't have a couch, but it didn't feel desolate anymore. It felt like a blank canvas. The stack of aggressive red envelopes was gone from the kitchen counter, replaced by a tidy single folder of legal paperwork managed by the Navy JAG office. The underground fights were over. The CPS probationary period was functioning smoothly, a weekly phone call that Clara made from her clinic office, reporting nothing but a thriving, safe environment for the child. In the living room, Leo was sprawled on his stomach on a thick, comfortable area rug Clara had brought over, kicking his feet in the air as he worked on a math worksheet. The bandage on his right arm was completely gone, leaving only a shiny patch of healing pink skin. More importantly, the oversized oven mitts had been shoved to the very back of a kitchen drawer. Leo wasn't the man of the house anymore. He didn't have to carry the weight of his father's survival. He was just an 8-year-old boy complaining about fractions. Clara stood at the kitchen counter, pouring 2 cups of tea. Elias walked into the room, and the transformation in him was profound. The dark, hollow shadows under his eyes were steadily fading. The bruises on his jaw had turned a dull, healing yellow, and the split on his lip was gone. He wasn't limping. But the biggest change wasn't physical. It was the sheer absence of the suffocating, desperate tension he used to carry in his shoulders. He stopped next to Clara, leaning his hip against the counter. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood in the quiet warmth of the kitchen, watching his son doing homework on the floor. "He asked me this morning if you were going to be here for Thanksgiving," Elias said quietly, his voice a low, steady rumble. Clara handed him a mug. "What did you tell him?" Elias took the mug. His bruised, calloused fingers brushed against hers, and he didn't pull away. "I told him you'd have to check your schedule, but that I was really hoping you would." Clara looked up at him. The guarded, intimidating SEAL captain she had met in the clinic was entirely gone. In his place was a man who had survived the worst storm of his life, and who was finally, cautiously, allowing himself to look at the horizon. "My schedule is clear," Clara said softly. Elias let out a slow breath, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. Good. It wasn't a grand, sweeping declaration of romance. They didn't need one. Their bond hadn't been built on easy attraction or perfect circumstances. It had been forged in the absolute darkest hour of his life. She had seen him broken, desperate, and stripped of all his defenses, and she had chosen to stand beside him and fight anyway. Love, Clara realized, wasn't just about how you looked at someone. It was about who held the line when you couldn't stand anymore. Elias set his tea down and walked into the living room. He sat down heavily on the rug next to Leo, pointing at a math problem and murmuring something that made the boy laugh. Within 10 minutes, Elias's head was resting on his folded arm. His breathing slowed, deepening into the steady, rhythmic cadence of true, untroubled sleep. Leo looked up at Clara, a bright smile on his face, and put a finger to his lips. "Shh," Clara smiled back. She walked into the living room, grabbed a heavy quilt from the corner, and gently draped it over Elias's broad shoulders. He didn't wake up. The fiercely protective father, the man who had fought in underground cages just to keep a roof over his son's head, was finally resting. Clara sat down on the rug beside them. She watched the steady rise and fall of Elias's chest, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over the quiet house. Elias Thorne had spent the last 14 months taking all the hits to protect his family. Now, he finally had someone to protect him.